Hello and welcome back. So today we'll be analyzing the exact opposite of the contract year bump. In a previous video, I analyzed the contract year bump phenomenon to see if the data really backed up the premise, and if you haven't seen that video, I'll link it in the description below. Today, we'll be looking at what happens after players score that once-in-a-lifetime contract in free agency. So just an introduction, Boomer Gordon on NHL Radio, Sirius XM, Channel 91, was the first person that I heard call it the Moneybags Syndrome. And his running joke is that the player's pockets has so much money in it that it literally drags his pants down and makes him slower on the ice. The logic is that a player usually only hits free agency about once, maybe twice in their career, and most players make the bulk of their money in their entire hockey career from this one contract. So guys are incentivized to perform in the year leading up to that contract, and then after that contract is signed, these guys are usually less incentivized to perform, especially during the regular season. So the first thing I wanted to know after hearing about this phenomenon was, is this actually true? Does the data back this up? And if so, how does this impact fantasy? So let's dive into the data. Let's start with the 2019 free agent class. And in this class, there's a couple of really interesting takeaways. So the first thing you notice is Artemi Panarin had a quote-unquote Moneybags year for the ages. This almost never happens. He signed a massive deal, a 7-year times $11.6+ million deal in New York. Basically chose exactly where he wanted to go, got a massive amount of money to do it, and then came back and put up the best season of his entire career at a 1.37 point per game average, and he was one of the 3 finalists for the Hart Trophy. That almost never happens. So this is an incredibly rare feat, and that kind of, and if you look at his production, so he wasn't in the league here, .962, .902, 1.01, 1.1, and then he follows that up with a 1.37. So he was trending in the right direction, but man, that's a huge jump from 1.1 to 1.37. So that's a pretty rare occurrence. But the other thing that you'll notice is that 8 of the 10 players in this, the top 10 free agent contracts, according to total contract value, 8 of the 10 underperformed both their 5-year averages and their previous season averages for points per game. The worst offender of this crop of players was Matt Duchene, who underperformed his previous season by 0.52 points per game. Now, some of that is it's not really an anomaly in the data, but let me explain how that happened. So his range was in that 0.7, 0.67, 0.77, in that general channel for production. Then this year here, he kind of inflated his numbers. So you'll remember this was the year he started the season with Ottawa, and he was averaging 1.16 point per game average at that point, 58 points in 50 games. Then he was traded to Columbus for 23 games, where he slid all the way down to a 0.52 point per game average. And then he followed that up after signing a massive free agent deal in Nashville for 7 times 8. He followed that up with a 0.636 point per game average. So a slight bump from what he did in Columbus, but not much in the way of production, and especially a huge drop from the previous season. The next highest guy who dropped in production was Joe Pavelski. So Pavelski signed a 3-year, $21 million deal with the Stars, and although he worked out very nicely in the years since then, and he probably will work out again this year because he's still on that top line and top power play unit, during his Moneybag year, his production fell from 64 points in 75 games to 31 points in 67 games, which pretty much was not ownable in fantasy. If you look at the Moneybag year, 0.46 point per game average, I wouldn't have been targeting him at all. I wouldn't even have, looked twice at him in this particular year for fantasy. Now, the average underperformance this season was 0.197 points per game average. That's the difference between the Moneybag year and the previous season. And then the overperformance was pretty much just Panarin, because if you look here at Anders Lee, this is just marginal. I mean, he basically hit right on the nose. So 0.63, 0.62. This is within the margin of error. So basically, 8 guys were underperforming, 1 guy pushed, and then 1 guy significantly overperformed. So that's basically what you see in the 2019 file. But what about 2020, the next year? So as we look at this crop, so the top 2 guys were still under. The top 4 guys were still under. The top 4 out of 5 guys were still underperforming compared to both their previous year average and their 5-year average. The only overperformer was Tyler Toffoli, who had a nice year there. And then, 7, did I have this right? This doesn't look right. 7 of the 10 underperformed. Yeah, that is 7. I can count. So 7 of the 10 underperformed both their previous year and their 5-year average. The one caveat here is the Dadonov file. So Dadonov only played 3 years, so his 5-year average was calculated on a lot less data than the other players here. But still, he massively underperformed his 5-year average, but he also massively underperformed his previous season. So if you look at that .36, that's not fantasy ownable. That .68 is borderline fantasy ownable, but he significantly underproduced when push came to shove after signing that deal in Vegas. So the silver lining here is that the 3 guys who overperformed after their free agent contracts did so at a really good rate. So if you look at Toffoli, he was above .2, his previous season average. Craig Smith was up .14 above his previous season average, which is nice and kind of made him a little bit fantasy relevant. And then Justin Schultz, .33 above his previous season's average. So that is one silver lining. Most of these guys were underperforming the previous season's totals, but the guys who didn't underperform actually did really well. But as we can see from this class, as well as the 2019 class, the Moneybags Syndrome theory pretty much held true. Again, there's a few who significantly overproduced, but the odds were that if you took one of these 10 guys, you had a 70% chance of underperformance from that player. And then we'll move right on to the 2021 free agency class. And it was a bit more interesting and a bit less conclusive. So the top free agent was Dougie Hamilton, and he was the top underperformer at .28 compared to the previous season. And 3 of the top 4 free agents underperformed their previous seasons, but 8 of the top 10 overperformed their 5-year averages, as you can see here. So 4 of the top 5, and technically speaking, 4 of the top 6, but this is basically a push. Jamie Oleksiak, pretty much hitting it right on. So 3 of the top 4 underperformed. But if you look at the difference from the 5-year average, all but 2 players overperformed their 5-year averages. So that's a little bit different. In fact, that's kind of counterintuitive to an extent. And if you notice, Zach Hyman right here at the second free agent underperformed his previous season slightly, but overperformed his 5-year average. Same with Blake Coleman. Jaden Schwartz did the opposite and overperformed his previous season, but underperformed his 5-year average. So that's a little weird as well. You're noticing a couple of trends here, and this one doesn't really make any sense. So a lot of the weirdness in this free agents class, as far as the Moneybags file goes, is why did this happen? Why were a couple of guys overproducing their previous season and overproducing versus their previous season, underproducing compared to their 5-year average, or vice versa? So my best answer to that is scoring increased from 5.9 goals per game to 6.3 goals per game last year. There were 119 goalies who played in the NHL last season, which is absolutely insane. And that may have been part of the scoring increase. And if you add that scoring increase, now that increase came during these players' money bag years, which is why we see a lot less underperformance. So typically we would see 7 or 8 guys out of this 10 underperform. Here we only see 4 or 3 really. And I would venture to say that the reason that this happened is because scoring was up last year. And there was not a lot of room for under-improvement because a rising tide, technically in this case, lifts all boats. So all of these players' averages were floated a little bit higher by the increase in scoring. So yeah, despite this slightly different season, the trend still does hold somewhat true, especially for the guys who made the absolute most money in free agency. So again, these guys at the top, they still underperformed by and large. Now, just another quick note here. Philip Deneau overperformed by .19, but the majority of his contract value, or the reason why he was signed, was not necessarily due to regular season production. It was due to that masterclass in the playoffs where he shut down a number of the top NHL centers and a number of the top offensive lines as Montreal went to the finals. So that boosted his value and probably put him in this range contract-wise as opposed to his regular season totals. So yeah, that's just another little tidbit to keep in mind. And then the significant overproducer was Mikael Granlund. So he did very well after getting that contract. But if you remember, like, that wasn't one of the big contracts. I believe it was like 5x5. So, not a massive amount of money the way that Dougie Hamilton made a massive amount of money. And some of these other guys on this list. Remember, this was the same year that there were a lot of RFA defensemen. Now, I didn't cover RFA defensemen because they don't have as many rights. They don't have the ability to choose where they can go, and it's not that one contract that sets them up for life necessarily. It can financially if you're Darnell Nurse or one of these other guys that signed for 9x8 or whatever they signed for. But they have less freedom, so they're less likely to be massively overpaid the way that maybe a Dougie Hamilton was. But I don't necessarily call that an overpayment. Just he didn't have a good year last year. We'll see what he does this year. But speaking of this year, what happens this year? So 2022 free agent class. So as we look at this class, the guys who just signed over this summer, what you're looking at the bottom here is their performance during their contract year. So this is what this is right here. And I did this for the contract bump analysis video. So you can see that 7 of the 10 here overperformed their 5-year averages. And that's what they did in their contract year. So their contract year was part of that season where scoring was up to 6.3 goals per game. And if you expect scoring to regress, maybe somewhere around that 6.1 goal per game or 6 goal per game average, then these players are especially due for a regression, because they were arguably due for a regression, especially the guys at the top. I mean, they just put up absolute monster career seasons in a contract year, so they were already potentially due for regression. On top of that, they both signed massive deals in free agency. They both went to new teams. And then on top of that, if you think that goal scoring is going to come down a little bit from where it was last year, then there's a lot baked into those two files in terms of regression. And as a result of this, there's only 2 players on this list that I would consider really good value this year in fantasy. And you can notice here that's Vincent Trocheck and Claude Giroux. And the narrative actually fits them well as well. So with Trocheck, he underperformed last year, especially in the second half of the season. So in the second half, he put up 23 points in 42 games, which was a .54 point per game average. But he's coming to a very talented Rangers team. He's going to be in the top 6, probably playing with Panarin, and he may factor in on PP1. And if he does that, then he definitely becomes value in this range. And also, he didn't sign. I mean, it was a massive deal in terms of term, but to take under 6 and then to spread it out over 7 years, that's kind of a reasonable amount of money in terms of AAV. So he didn't get a humongous overpayment. And to be fair, Kadri took a little bit less to be on a competitive team. Gaudreau could have probably made more if he had chosen to go to Philly or New Jersey or something. So there wasn't a crazy amount of money given out this year, primarily because of the COVID happenings and everything that's going on with the cap, and how the cap has not increased in a couple of years by any significant amount. It's usually just getting bumped by $1 million or so. And then with Giroux, last year he put up a .866 point per game average when he was underperforming. So, this is his underperformance season. This is his average. So his average is .942. And then he underperformed that, and his underperformance is still fantasy relevant. It's really good, actually. And if you remember, he's a really good power play guy, usually above that 20 power play point per season pace. So he could be a pretty good value. And then on top of that, the narrative, he's coming into a stacked top 6. He's going to play with Stützle and DeBrincat. That's been the word coming out of Ottawa from their coaching staff, that's where they're going to start him. They might start him on the wing, but he's probably going to have dual position eligibility because of that. He's a center and a wing, and on top of that, he's playing with Stützle and DeBrincat, who are 2 very offensive players, so there is upside baked into that file. But the main question with him and Trocheck is, are they going to get PP1 time? Now, I would think Giroux does, just given his production over the last number of years and his leadership qualities and whatnot. Trocheck might. He fits that Strome right shot position on the opposite side of Zibanejad, or in the bumper spot potentially, but they do have Lafreniere, they do have Kako, they do have a couple of other guys that they would maybe want to get some looks at on the PP1, so that's the only other factor that might play into these two files potentially not overproducing these numbers. But by and large, a lot of these guys are set for regression. Not a ton, but they are set for regression. So as we saw in the previous data, there usually aren't that many guys who overproduce after getting paid, but the ones who do significantly overproduce. So if you remember back, Panarin was plus 0.27, Toffoli was up 0.20, Justin Schultz was up 0.33, Mikael Granlund was up 0.27, and Deneau was up 0.19. So it's very difficult to take a shot on one of these 10 guys and hit it, but if you do pick one of these guys, there is maybe a 20 or 30% chance that the guy that you pick is going to significantly overproduce compared to his previous season. But everybody else is pretty much due for a regression just based on what I just mentioned about the scoring difference and the fact that these guys really overproduced in their contract years. With some of these other names, I wouldn't necessarily expect them to drop their production by like half of a point per game or something. But for argument's sake, like let's say Johnny Gaudreau did fall that much. He dropped a half a point per game. He would still put up 0.9 points per game or about 73-point pace. And if he's drafted in the third round range, like that's where he's going right now in mock drafts, third or fourth round range, that's not terrible value. Like you're still getting something out of Johnny Gaudreau. And I honestly don't see him dropping well below his 5-year average to a 0.9. That would be worst case scenario. So if he regresses a normal amount, like the average amount that this regression has happened over the past 3 seasons was in that 0.15 to 0.2 range, that still puts him well above a point per game average and still very good for your team. So you're still going to get production. If he drops 0.2, he's down to 1.2. If he drops 0.2, he's a point per game guy. So with these two top guys, they're definitely due for a regression, but that doesn't necessarily mean you stay away from them. And with Kadri, I've seen him going in the 8th round in some mock drafts. So if you can get a point per game center who's in a pretty good situation in Calgary, who's probably going to have a lot of opportunity in the top 6, maybe some power play time, etc., and you're getting him in the 8th round, he's going to be regressing from this 1.22 number. There's pretty much a lot of conviction in terms of the data, but he may not go all the way back to this 5-year average. He might just drop like 0.2 and still be a point per game guy. So these aren't necessarily guys to stay away from, but what you want to keep in mind is as you look at any of these guys in your draft suite, if you'll see their previous season's numbers, you have to understand that there's going to be a regression. There's going to be the Moneybags Syndrome baked in. They just got paid. All these guys are switching teams, so they have to adjust. As I've mentioned in a number of videos, it's a lot easier to try to get these guys the second year after they make this move as opposed to the first year, because there's just a lot more unknown in that first year. There's a lot more risk baked into that file. And sometimes players like to do that. They like to go out on a limb. They like to take a risk in fantasy and grab one of these guys because it's high risk, high reward. But if you do that earlier in your draft, you're potentially setting yourself up to lose. You want to take risks later in your draft. So for this group of players, Gaudreau would be value in the 3rd or 4th round range. Kadri, if he's there in the 8th round. Trocheck, I've seen pretty deep in drafts. That would be a value play. I don't necessarily see a lot happening with Andre Palat. He's right in the same channel, that 0.64 range. Not exactly a fantasy, huge fantasy production guy. Andrew Copp, I would see regression from this file just because he had a lot of good things going for him last year. He had, they lost Line in Winnipeg, so he got bumped up into the top 6. Then he starts playing with Artemi Panarin and Ryan Strome, so his production went up significantly last year. I would expect it to fall closer to this 0.51, maybe in that 0.6 range. Burakovsky, he might get more of an opportunity in Seattle, but he's on a much worse offense, so I would expect regression there, closer to his 5-year average. Ryan Strome is going to get an opportunity as well, and he's not going to get overdrafted too much because people are kind of staying away from him, knowing that that's the narrative around his file. The guy that I would target, as I mentioned before, Trocheck and Giroux. Giroux would be the number one guy to target off of this list just because he didn't overperform when scoring was up in the league. So this underperformance is a little bit more than what you're seeing in the data just because overall scoring jumped, and in addition to that, he still regressed as opposed to staying the same or going a little bit above what he usually does. So he's kind of primed for a bounce back season, and he usually gets close to a point per game average. And he's not going to get overdrafted. I don't think he's going to be seen in the top 6 rounds or whatever. So if you're looking to take on that additional risk, and as we saw, there is reward because a lot of the guys, there's a 20 to 30% chance that if you pick a guy from this list, he will overperform his previous season's numbers. But if he does, the guys who did that in the previous seasons, we saw Panarin and Schultz and all those guys, they overperformed by a lot. So if you're going to take that risk, I would take it deeper in the draft as opposed to taking one of these guys up top and hoping that they overperform career seasons. So that's just a little bit of the value equation that you have to do during your fantasy drafting period. But if you do that properly, you can find really good value and you can stay away from players who are going to return you absolutely nothing. And that's the goal, is to not waste a pick in the top 6 to 8 rounds of your draft, depending on league size. Keep those top 6 or so guys as risk-free as you can possibly make them, because that's going to kill you if you swing and miss in that range. If you want to take risks, you take it deeper in the draft with one of these guys maybe at the bottom. And if you do that, you're potentially setting yourself up for a guy who's on a good situation, who's ready for a bounce back, and who is able to perform in that money bag season. Most guys can't do it, but the guys who do it at a ridiculous rate compared to some of the other guys, and as we saw with the previous data. So hopefully this answered some questions for you. Hopefully this was a little bit informative and insightful. Hopefully it can help your fantasy team. And if you got any value out of this, leave me a comment, like and subscribe, obviously all that crap. And then, just thank you for paying attention again, sticking with it all the way to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.